The Battle of Geonosis was already in its final, desperate hour, when something fell from the upper atmosphere that nobody had launched, and nobody had tracked, and nobody on either side of the conflict could account for. The Republic gunships were still running extraction patterns over the arena. The Jedi who had survived the opening slaughter were pulling back to defensible ground, and the Separatist droid army was pressing forward across the red dust plains in the relentless, mechanical rhythm that made it so difficult to fight. Not because any individual unit was dangerous, but because the numbers never ended, and the numbers didn't feel pain, and the numbers didn't stop. Mace Windu was coordinating the withdrawal from the air. Yoda had just arrived with the clone battalions and was already reshaping the tactical picture, and the battle was still genuinely uncertain when the impact happened. It hit the center of the droid formation like a meteor, except meteors don't leave craters with clean edges, and meteors don't stand up afterward and look around with the mildly confused expression of someone who has just missed their stop on a train. The crater was 200 meters wide. The droids in the surrounding 600 meters had ceased to be functional in any meaningful sense, and in the center of all of it, completely unharmed, stood a short man in a white cape and a yellow suit, brushing red Geonosian dust off his gloves with the patient attention of someone who has spilled something on themselves and is deciding whether it's worth worrying about. This was only the beginning, and the galaxy was not remotely prepared for what came next. If you're still watching after the first few minutes of this, you already understand this story is not going to follow any path you've seen before. Subscribe now, because what this galaxy is about to experience cannot be undone, and you'll want to be here for every part of it. The crater Saitama had made in the center of the Separatist droid formation was 200 meters across and roughly 4 meters deep at its lowest point, and the geometry of it was wrong in a way that took a moment to identify precisely, but became clear once you looked at it carefully enough. Meteor impacts produce irregular, radiating damage patterns because the energy of the impact distributes unevenly through the ground material, and the debris field follows the path of least resistance outward in directions that vary based on the composition of what it's hitting. This crater was almost perfectly circular, with edges that were clean and consistent all the way around, because the energy that had produced it had come from a single point, specifically, from the soles of a man's boots making contact with the Geonosian surface at a velocity the surface had not been designed to receive. The physics of the impact had distributed perfectly outward from that single point, because the point itself hadn't moved or compressed or spread on contact. It had simply arrived, and the ground had responded to the arrival the only way available to it. Saitama stood at the center of the crater and looked at the landscape around him with the careful, methodical attention of someone trying to establish where they are from available visual evidence. The sky was the wrong color, a deep, burnt amber rather than the pale gray of City Z's overcast mornings, which was his primary reference point for outdoor skis since City Z's weather was reliably unpleasant. The ground was red dust over pale rock, and the air was dry and carried heat in a way that suggested a climate entirely unlike anything in his experience. The structures visible on the horizon were organic and curved in the way of things built by something that wasn't human, and the flat plain between him and those structures was covered in what appeared to be a very large army of metal figures that had, in the immediate vicinity of his landing, stopped being a functioning army and become a debris field. He looked at the debris field for a moment, noting its extent, and then looked down at his feet where the crater edge met the flat surface of his landing point, and then looked back up at the sky from which he had apparently descended, and concluded with the practical certainty of someone assembling obvious evidence that he was not in City Z anymore, and probably not in any city he was familiar with. The droid army's response to the impact had been the response of a system that processes events through a command architecture. There was a pause of approximately 3 seconds while the battle network registered the anomaly, rerouted the tactical assessment, and issued a new directive. And then the nearest functional units, which were B-1 battle droids at a distance of about 300 meters from the crater's edge, began moving toward the impact point with their blasters raised. There were approximately 400 of them converging from the nearest intact formations, which represented a fraction of the total Separatist force on the field, but was still a number that would have been a serious problem for any conventional target at the center of the crater. Saitama watched them approach with the mild, appraising interest he applied to anything unfamiliar, nodding the way they moved, the fact that they appeared to be machines rather than living things, and the red energy at the ends of what he correctly identified as weapons, even without knowing what kind of weapons they were. The blasters fired when the nearest units reached 200 meters, which was the engagement range their targeting systems had been calibrated for against Republic clone troopers in standard armor. The bolts crossed the distance in fractions of a second and connected with Saitama across approximately 40 simultaneous impacts, and the result was the same result that everything produced when it connected with Saitama, which was nothing meaningful. The bolts hit him and the energy dispersed across his suit's surface and left scorch marks that were already fading as the material cooled, and Saitama looked down at the marks with the expression of someone who has just had something flicked at them by a bored child. He looked back up at the 400 approaching droids. He looked at the broader plain beyond them, where the battle was continuing across a scale he hadn't fully assessed yet, but which was clearly very large. He looked at the strange sky one more time, then back at the droids, and made the practical decision that the droids were in the way of him getting a better look at what was happening on this planet, which was the primary thing he currently wanted to do. He walked toward them, not at speed, not with any aggressive forward lean or combat posture, walked, the same unhurried pace he used to get to the convenience store when it wasn't raining and he wasn't in a hurry. The droids fired continuously as he closed the distance, the blaster volume increasing as more units acquired the target and added their output, and the cumulative fire was a sustained energy event that kicked up a red dust haze around his moving figure and accomplished nothing structural. When he reached the first rank of droids, he didn't punch them. He walked through them, which was different, and the difference was that walking through them meant they were obstacles in a path rather than opponents in a fight, and the distinction showed in the way each one that he made contact with was addressed, not struck with intent, but simply moved out of the space he was occupying, which, given the differential in structural integrity between Saitama and a B-1 battle droid, produced outcomes that were functionally identical to destruction, but felt, from Saitama's perspective, like walking through a crowd. The hole he made in the droid formation was 400 units wide and perfectly linear, and on the far side of it, the rest of the Separatist army's nearest battalion was now looking at a gap in its formation that had not been there 30 seconds ago, with no tactical explanation for how it had appeared. 300 meters above the battlefield, in a Republic LAAT gunship running extraction coordination, Mace Windu looked down at the gap through the gunship's side viewport and felt, through the Force, something that stopped him mid-sentence in the middle of a tactical directive to the clone captain beside him. He had felt disturbances in the Force before, had felt presences, absences, echoes of the dark side, the cold clarity of violence, the specific texture of suffering on a large scale. What he felt now was none of those things. It was the sensation of the Force itself encountering something it couldn't read, the way a sound system encounters a frequency outside its range, not silence, but the edge of silence, the place where the instrument's capability ends and something exists beyond it that the instrument cannot characterize. He looked down at the gap in the droid formation, and at the small figure moving through the far edge of it at a walking pace, and said nothing for several seconds, because he was a very experienced Jedi Master, and very experienced Jedi Masters do not say the first thing that comes to mind when the first thing that comes to mind is something they don't have a category for. "Master Windu," the clone captain said. Mace kept his eyes on the figure below. "Take us lower," he said. Mace Windu had been a Jedi Master for long enough that his relationship with the Force had moved past the stage of active consultation and into something closer to continuous ambient awareness. The way a person who has lived in a house for decades knows the sound of every room without having to think about it. He didn't ask the Force questions anymore in the way younger Jedi did. He didn't need to, because the information arrived before the question fully formed, the way experienced knowledge always does when it has been integrated deeply enough into a person's functioning that it stops feeling like knowledge and starts feeling like the air they breathe. The Force told him things about every living being in his vicinity at all times, not in words or images, but in the direct, unmediated way of something that predated language. The texture of a person's intent, the weight of their emotional state, the thread of their presence in the living current that connected everything. It had never failed to tell him something. Every being he had ever encountered, from the most powerful Sith Lord to the most ordinary civilian on the most ordinary planet in the galaxy, had a presence in the Force that could be read, even if the reading was faint or complex or deliberately obscured through training. The Force had always answered. The gunship descended to 50 meters above the battlefield, and Mace looked at the figure below, and the Force did not answer. Not a faint reading, not an obscured one, not the specific trained blankness of a Force sensitive who had learned to suppress their presence, which had its own texture, a deliberate absence that felt like held breath, detectable precisely because of the effort required to maintain it. This was different. This was the Force encountering the figure and returning nothing, not because the figure was hiding, but because the figure existed in a category the Force did not have a signal for. It was the difference between a room that is dark, because the lights are off, and a room that is dark, because the concept of light does not apply to it. Mace had read about this in the oldest Jedi texts, the ones that predated the current Order's written records, and existed only in fragments archived in the deepest levels of the Jedi Temple's library. The texts described it as a theoretical condition, a being so thoroughly outside the Force's architecture that the Force's sensory apparatus simply found no surface to register against. The texts had treated it as mythology. Mace was currently 50 meters above the proof that the texts had been wrong about that classification. Below him, Saitama had emerged from the far side of the droid formation and was standing at the edge of an open section of battlefield looking at the broader engagement, with the focused, evaluating attention of someone trying to understand the rules of a game they've wandered into the middle of. The battle was still active across the full plain, clone battalions engaging droid armor on the eastern flank, Republic gunships trading fire with Separatist air units overhead. The dust and noise and scale of it all creating the kind of environment that would have been completely overwhelming to any normal person trying to process it for the first time. Saitama processed it with the calm of someone watching a complicated traffic intersection and waiting for a gap to cross. He had identified two distinct sides, the metal ones and the ones in white armor, and had formed a working hypothesis that the metal ones were the more immediate navigational obstacle based on the fact that they had been the ones shooting at him, which was a reasonable basis for a preliminary assessment even without any additional context. A Separatist Hailfire droid rolled into his section of the field from the eastern formation, its ring-shaped missile launchers tracking toward the Republic position he had inadvertently ended up standing near. It was a large piece of hardware, 4 meters tall at its launcher mounts, designed to deliver sustained heavy ordnance fire against armored Republic positions, and it represented the kind of battlefield asset that required coordinated anti-armor response from a clone unit to address effectively under normal tactical conditions. It registered Saitama as an unidentified biological unit in its targeting zone, and processed him as a secondary target, while it continued tracking its primary objective. Saitama looked at it with mild interest. It was the largest machine he had seen on the field so far, and the ring launcher mechanism was genuinely unusual from an engineering standpoint, and he spent a moment looking at it the way someone looks at an unfamiliar piece of equipment they've encountered in someone else's workshop. Then it fired a missile that passed close enough to his left shoulder to heat the air beside his ear, and he looked at the missile's trail, and then back at the Hailfare droid, and made the assessment that this particular machine was going to continue being a navigational problem unless addressed. He addressed it with a single open palm strike to the chassis, the kind of contact that in his own universe he reserved for things he was trying not to destroy completely. A measured application rather than a committed punch, the equivalent of someone firmly moving a piece of furniture rather than throwing it. The Hailfare droid's chassis absorbed the strike for approximately 1 millisecond before the structural integrity of the materials involved reached its limit simultaneously across every load-bearing element. And the result was that the droid ceased to be a droid and became a fast-moving collection of components that redistributed themselves across a 40-meter radius. The shockwave from the impact flattened the 6 nearest battle droids, rolled across the dust in a visible ring, and rocked the Republic clone unit positioned 80 meters behind Saitama hard enough that 2 troopers lost their footing. Commander Cody, running that unit's ground engagement, watched his men stumble and looked toward the source of the shockwave, and found a man in a yellow suit standing in the smoking absence of what had been a Hailfare droid 30 seconds ago, looking at his own hand with the mild, slightly puzzled expression of someone who had used more force than they intended on something fragile. On the gunship above, Mace Windu watched the Hailfare droid's destruction and made a decision. He turned to the clone pilot and said, "Set us down," in the tone he used when a decision had been made and the only remaining variable was execution. The pilot looked at the active battlefield below them with the professional skepticism of someone whose job it was to keep Republic hardware intact. "Sir, the field is still. Set us down," Mace said again, with the same tone which contained no additional emphasis because it didn't need any. The gunship descended. Meanwhile, 3,000 kilometers away in a secured Separatist command ship in high orbit above Geonosis, Count Dooku was receiving a battlefield data feed that contained an anomaly his tactical system had flagged with a priority level it had never used before. The flag was not for a new Republic weapon. It was not for an unexpected tactical development in the ground engagement. It was for an unclassified biological unit whose impact data, compiled from the Battle Network's sensor array across multiple engagement events in the last 8 minutes, did not correspond to any species profile, any known enhanced combatant record, or any experimental program the Separatist intelligence archive contained. Dooku studied the data with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who has spent a long life learning that the things that don't fit the existing categories are always the things worth paying attention to. He reached out to the Force with the disciplined precision of a man who had been trained by the best the Jedi Order had ever produced before he had decided the Order was insufficient, and he touched the data's source point on Geonosis below, and he found the same thing Mace Windu had found. Nothing. A complete and total absence of Force presence from something that was demonstrably, measurably, consequentially there. He withdrew from the attempt and sat back in his command chair and said nothing for a long moment, his fingers steepled in front of him in the posture he adopted when something required the full undivided weight of his considerable intelligence. Then he opened a channel to his ground commanders. "The unclassified unit in the central engagement zone," he said. "I want it brought to me. Do not damage it." There was a pause on the channel. "With respect, Count," the commander said carefully, "our units that have engaged it directly have not. The results have not been." "I know," Dooku said. "Send more." The Jedi High Council chamber at the top of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant had seen a significant number of extraordinary things discussed within its circular walls across the long history of the Order. It had processed the news of Darth Maul's appearance on Tatooine, The revelation of the clone army's existence on Kamino, the steady darkening of the force that had been building across the years of the Separatist crisis, like weather pressure accumulating before a storm that everyone could feel and nobody could fully locate. The masters who sat in those chairs had between them accumulated more combined experience with force anomalies, dark side manifestations, and galactic-level threats than any other group of beings in the known galaxy. And that accumulated experience was the reason the Council existed. Because some categories of problem required the synthesis of multiple extraordinary perspectives before a response could be responsibly formulated. Mace Windu's emergency transmission from Geonosis, arriving while the battle was still active and before the formal after-action reports had been compiled, was the kind of communication that required an immediate session, and the Council had convened within the hour through a combination of physical presence and holographic projection that left half the chairs occupied by blue-lit translucent figures from across the galaxy. Mace delivered his report with the characteristic precision of someone who has decided that the most useful thing he can do with an extraordinary experience is transmit it as accurately as possible without editorializing. He described what he had seen from the gunship, what the Force had returned when he reached for a reading, and the specific quality of the absence, not the trained concealment of a Force-sensitive, not the dead zone of a Usalamiri's bubble, not any known phenomenon that produced Force blindness through a recognized mechanism. He described a being that existed in a space the Force's sensory architecture simply did not cover, the way a map covers territory up to its edge and then stops, and what lies beyond the edge is not absent but uncharted. He had landed, he said, and approached the figure directly, and had been close enough to speak to him, though the conversation had been brief because the battle was still active and the figure's attention had been distributed across multiple simultaneous developments. What he had learned from the brief exchange was limited but informative. The being's name was Saitama. He was from somewhere called City Z. He had arrived via what he described as a light, which Mace recognized as consistent with a dimensional displacement event of a kind the Jedi texts referenced, but which had never been observed in the current era. He had been trying to find a grocery store, which was a statement Mace delivered with the same measured neutrality he applied to every other element of the report, because, in his experience, the things that sounded the most implausible were often the most significant. Yoda listened to all of this from his chair with his eyes half closed, and the specific quality of stillness he maintained when processing information that required more than his ordinary attention. He had felt the disturbance from Geonosis himself, hours before Mace's transmission, had felt it the way he felt everything significant, not as a localized event, but as a ripple through the whole of the living force, a distortion in the field that connected all things that was not darkness and was not light, and was not any frequency the force normally carried. It had woken him from meditation. In 800 years of life, the Force had woken him from meditation twice, and both times the cause had been events of civilization-scale consequence. He had not told anyone this before Mace's transmission arrived. He was telling the Council now, which produced a quality of silence in the chamber that was different from ordinary deliberative silence. It was the silence of 12 of the most experienced Force users in the galaxy, simultaneously registering that the situation they were discussing was larger than the category they had initially been preparing to assign it to. Mundi, whose practical and analytical mind was one of the Council's primary assets in situations requiring rapid threat assessment, was the first to speak after Yoda's disclosure. If the disturbance woke Master Yoda from meditation, he said, choosing his words with the precision that characterized everything he said, then what we are discussing is not an anomaly in the local sense. We are discussing something that has introduced a new variable into the Force itself at a scale that affects the whole. Mace nodded. That's consistent with what I observed on the ground, he said. The Force doesn't fail to read things. It reads everything. If this being exists outside that reading, it's not because of a gap in our technique or a limitation of our individual sensitivity. It's because the Force, as a system, doesn't have a category for what he is. The Council processed this in collective silence for a moment that stretched long enough to become significant. Plo Koon, whose species' sensory capabilities operated across spectrums that human Force users didn't access directly, said quietly, "I felt it too. From Doran, the disturbance traveled." Several other masters confirmed the same, each from a different location across the galaxy, and the confirmation built a picture that the Council sat with and absorbed. Whatever Saitama was, his arrival had been felt through the Force across interstellar distances, not because he was powerful in the Force's terms, but because the Force itself had registered a gap in its own coverage, and the gap's edges were visible from everywhere. The strategic question arrived naturally from the assessment, and it was Depab Balaba who gave it the clearest formulation. "The Separatists have his location," she said. "Dooku's intelligence network covers Geonosis comprehensively. If we felt the disturbance, their Force sensitives felt it too, and their tactical systems would have flagged the impact event in the battle data. They will attempt to retrieve him before we can establish communication." Mace looked at her. "They already have," he said. "I watched them send 3 full companies of droids to his position before I left the field. The last thing I saw before the gunship cleared the engagement zone was all 3 companies in various states of no longer being companies." He paused. He didn't notice them doing it. He was looking at a piece of Hailfire droid wreckage at the time. "I think he finds the machinery interesting." The chamber was quiet again, and this time the quality of the silence was slightly different from the previous ones. It contained the specific texture of very serious people recalibrating their assessment of how serious a situation is, which on the Jedi Council produced a particular kind of gravity that was recognizable to anyone who had spent time in the room. Yoda opened his eyes fully, which he did rarely during council sessions and which meant something when he did. "Find him, we must," he said, "before others do, not to contain him, not to study him, to understand." He paused, and the pause had the weight of 800 years of accumulated wisdom deciding how to compress itself into a single sentence. "The Force does not go blind without reason. What it cannot see, important, that is, perhaps most important of all." He closed his eyes again. In the holographic chairs, the projected masters looked at each other across the distances of space that separated them physically, and the shared understanding that moved between them was the understanding of people who have just learned that the map they have been navigating with for 1,000 years has an edge they were never told about, and that something is standing on the other side of it. On Geonosis, now quiet in the aftermath of the battle's conclusion, Saitama was sitting on a piece of fallen Separatist architecture, examining a battle droid's detached head, with the focused curiosity of someone who has found an interesting piece of junk and is trying to figure out how it worked. He turned it over, found the photoreceptor lenses, noted the speaker grill, tapped the cranial casing twice with one finger in the way of someone assessing material density, and set it down when it failed to produce any further interesting information. He looked at the plain around him, now largely emptied of active combatants and covered in the debris of the engagement, and then at the twin moons beginning to appear in the Geonosian evening sky, and concluded that wherever he was, the day was ending. He put his hands in his pockets and began looking around for somewhere to sleep, because the day had been long and involved more being shot at than was ideal, and none of it had been particularly interesting, and he was tired in the way he was always tired, not physically, but in the deeper way that had followed him since the training, the persistent low-grade fatigue of a man waiting for something that would require him to be not tired. The shuttle that landed near Saitama's position 2 hours after the battle's conclusion was not a Republic vessel, and it was not a military transport, and it did not arrive with the aggressive, declarative energy of something sent to capture or contain. It was a sleek, dark-hulled craft with the kind of clean, considered design that communicated wealth and deliberate aesthetic choice, rather than function alone, and it set down on the Geonosian plain with the unhurried precision of something that had been piloted by someone who understood that the manner of an arrival communicates as much as the arrival itself. Two figures in dark robes descended the landing ramp and stood at its base, and neither of them moved toward Saitama's position immediately. They simply stood there, visible, making themselves available to approach rather than approaching, which was a choice that contained a sophisticated understanding of how to initiate contact with something you can't predict. Saitama, who had found a reasonably flat piece of fallen masonry to sit on, and had been watching the moons with the patient, idle attention of someone who has nothing urgent to do, noticed the shuttle land and watched the two figures emerge, and noted their decision not to approach, and found it mildly interesting compared to everything else that had tried to interact with him on this planet, which had mostly been machines that shot at him. Count Dooku descended last, alone, walking across the red dust with the measured, unhurried stride of a man who had been one of the most respected figures in the galaxy for the better part of a century, and had never once in that time felt the need to alter his pace to accommodate anyone else's expectations. He was tall and white-haired, and carried himself with the specific quality of authority that comes not from position, but from a lifelong accumulation of capability and the absolute certainty of one's own judgment. And he crossed the ground between the shuttle and Saitama's position with the air of someone paying a social call they have been looking forward to. He stopped 6 meters away. He looked at Saitama, sitting on his piece of masonry with his hands on his knees, and his expression the default mild attentiveness it always carried. And then he reached out to the Force with the full, practiced depth of a man who had been trained by Yoda himself before decades of additional refinement had made him one of the most accomplished Force users alive. The Force returned the same thing it had returned for Mace Windu, which was nothing, and Dooku processed the nothing with the outward composure of a man who had expected it, and the inward adjustment of a man who had expected it, but finds it differently significant when experienced directly compared to when it is received as a report. "You are difficult to find through conventional means," he said, in the measured, cultured tone of someone who selects their opening sentences the way a chess player selects an opening move. "My battle network required considerable cross-referencing of sensor data to locate you." Saitama looked at him. "I wasn't hiding," he said. Dooku found this answer interesting in the specific way that unguarded, direct responses are interesting to someone accustomed to navigating layers of strategy and subtext, not because it was remarkable, but because it was completely sincere, and complete sincerity was something Dooku encountered rarely enough that he recognized its texture immediately. "Of course not," he said. "Hiding implies awareness of pursuit. I suspect you had no reason to consider yourself pursued." He paused, noting that Saitama was looking at him with the attentive, patient expression of someone waiting for the useful part of a conversation to begin. He adjusted. Dooku had not remained relevant across a century of galactic politics by failing to read an audience. "You arrived on this planet during a significant battle," he said. "Your presence affected the outcome. I would like to understand what you are and where you came from, and I am in a position to offer resources that might help you understand where you are and how to navigate it." Saitama considered this with the serious, practical attention he applied to propositions that might affect his near-term situation. "Can you help me get home?" he asked. The directness of the question, cutting past everything Dooku had constructed around his opening position, produced a half-second pause that Dooku covered smoothly. "Potentially," he said, "that would require significant research into the nature of your arrival. It would take time and the cooperation of resources I control. I am proposing an exchange of information." Saitama thought about this. "What do you want to know?" he asked. Dooku studied him for a moment. "Everything," he said. What followed was a conversation that Dooku had prepared for with the thoroughness he applied to all significant engagements, and which proceeded in a direction his preparation had not fully anticipated. He had expected evasion or confusion, or the kind of guarded, strategic information management, that every significant actor in the galaxy employed when their origins and capabilities were being assessed by a potential adversary. He did not expect Saitama to simply answer every question accurately and completely, without apparent awareness that the information had strategic value, because Saitama operated from the foundational assumption that questions deserved honest answers unless there was a specific reason to withhold, and he had not yet identified a specific reason. He told Dooku about City Z, about the Hero Association, about the training, 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, 10 kilometers of running, every day for 3 years, no air conditioning in the summer and no heating in the winter, and about the result of the training, which he described as being able to beat any enemy with one punch. Delivered in the same tone of mild disappointment that he always used when describing it, because the result had solved the problem of danger, but created the problem of boredom, and the problem of boredom was the one he had never found a satisfying solution to. Dooku listened to all of it and said nothing for a long time after Saitama finished, because he was a man who understood the value of silence as a processing tool, and because what he had just heard required genuine processing. The training description was the element that required the most processing, not because it was extraordinary in the context of force training. Dooku had undertaken physical and mental disciplines across decades that would have been incomprehensible to an ordinary person, but because it was not force training, it contained no meditation, no attunement, no cultivation of connection to any external source of power. It was purely physical, purely repetitive, and by every model Dooku had available it should have produced an extremely fit baseline human and nothing more. The gap between what the training described and what the sensor data from the battle showed was a gap that no framework he possessed could bridge, and the inability to bridge it using any available framework meant that the framework itself was insufficient, which was the kind of conclusion that Dooku found genuinely deeply interesting in the way that only things which threatened to overturn foundational assumptions were interesting to a mind that had spent a century believing it had identified most of the foundational assumptions worth knowing. He looked at Saitama and felt the force's silence around him and made a decision that was partly strategic and partly something more honest than strategy. "I would like you to remain here," he said, "as my guest, while I research the question of your return." Saitama looked at the plain around them, at the debris and the moons and the general atmosphere of a planet that had recently hosted a large battle and was not yet recovered from it. "Is there food?" he asked. Dooku paused. "Abundantly," he said. "Then okay," Saitama said. 3 hours later, in the Separatist command ship in orbit, Dooku composed a message to Darth Sidious that he chose his words for more carefully than he chose words for almost anything. He described the anomaly accurately and completely, because Sidious was not a being one deceived through omission when the omitted information was of this magnitude, and Dooku had survived his relationship with Sidious this long partly through the discipline of knowing precisely what to withhold and what to disclose. He described the force blindness, the battle data, the conversation, the training that should not have produced what it had produced. He described the one statement from Saitama that had stayed with him most clearly after everything else, which was the description of the result, able to beat any enemy with one punch, delivered without pride or aggression or the performative confidence of someone who wants to be believed. Delivered as a mildly unfortunate fact about his own existence, the way someone might describe a medical condition that is not dangerous but is persistently inconvenient. Dooku sent the message and sat back and waited for the reply, and while he waited he looked at the report from the battle network one more time, specifically the section detailing the casualty figures from the 3 companies of droids sent to retrieve Saitama, which he had ordered knowing the outcome was uncertain, and had received back in the form of numbers that were in fact completely certain, just not in the direction he had intended. The certainty of those numbers, sitting in the report under the dry accounting language of a military after-action summary, was the most eloquent argument available for the proposition that what he had sitting in his guest quarters eating whatever the ship's kitchen had provided was not something the galaxy's existing power structures were equipped to classify, contain, or use. Sidious's reply arrived 40 minutes later. It contained 3 sentences. The first acknowledged the report. The second requested more data. The third was the sentence that Dooku read twice and then sat with in the silence of his command room, while the stars outside the viewport moved in their ancient, indifferent patterns. Do not let the Jedi reach him first. The Republic frigate came out of hyperspace above Geonosis 14 hours after the battle's conclusion, which was faster than standard post-engagement protocol allowed for, but slower than Mace Windu had pushed for when he made his case to the Council for an immediate return mission. The compromise between his urgency and the logistical reality of deploying a priority vessel from Coruscant had produced a 14-hour window, and Mace had spent most of that window in the frigate's meditation chamber doing something that was not quite meditation in the traditional sense, but was the closest available activity to what he actually needed, which was a sustained attempt to understand what he had felt on the ground at Geonosis before he went back to the ground at Geonosis. He had felt the Force's blindness from the air and confirmed it up close, and the confirmation had been complete and consistent, and had not offered any additional information beyond the fact of itself. What he had been attempting in the meditation chamber was not a renewed effort to read Saitama through the Force, which he had already established was impossible, but something different, an attempt to read the shape of the absence, the way you can learn something about an object by examining the space it occupies rather than the object directly. It was an approach documented in the oldest Jedi texts as a method for understanding things the Force couldn't see by examining what the Force could see around them. It was slow work, and it produced impressions rather than information, and the impression it produced after 14 hours of sustained effort was something Mace held carefully as the frigate dropped out of hyperspace and Geonosis appeared in the viewport below. The impression was not of darkness. It was not of light. It was the impression of something that existed at a level underneath the distinction between dark and light, the way bedrock exists underneath soil, not opposing the soil, not competing with it, not even aware of it in any purposeful sense. Just there, foundationally, in a way that predated the categories used to describe everything built on top of it. He didn't know what to do with this impression yet, but he filed it with the precision of someone who has learned that impressions encountered during serious contemplative practice have a way of becoming comprehensible later, when the context that makes them legible has had time to arrive. Obi-Wan Kenobi was on the frigate with him, which Mace had requested specifically, because Obi-Wan had 2 qualities that made him the right person for this kind of first contact situation. The first was his ability to engage with the completely unexpected without losing the thread of his own judgment, which was a quality that sounded straightforward, but was actually rare even among Jedi Masters, and was essentially absent in Jedi who relied too heavily on the Force's guidance to navigate ambiguity. The second was that he was genuinely good at conversation with beings who didn't want to be talked to, which was a skill that operated below the level of Force sensitivity, and was therefore one of the few tools that might be fully effective in this situation. Obi-Wan had spent the transit reading Mace's preliminary report and asking clarifying questions with the focused, methodical attention of someone building a working model of a situation they haven't encountered yet. And by the time the frigate reached Geonosis orbit, he had a working model that was clearly inadequate and clearly better than nothing, which was the most you could hope for going into something genuinely unprecedented. The problem presented itself as soon as they attempted to locate Saitama on the surface. The planet's sensor systems, patched together from Republic battlefield monitoring equipment left behind after the engagement, could track biological signatures through standard life-form detection, and Geonosis in the immediate post-battle period had a relatively manageable population of biological signatures once the clone battalions were factored out. What the sensors returned when tasked with locating Saitama specifically was a result that made the sensor operator report it as a possible equipment malfunction before Mace confirmed it was working correctly. The sensors could detect everything around Saitama: the residual heat signatures of the battlefield, the Geonosian insectoids moving through their underground structures, the atmospheric readings of the area, but the specific point where Saitama was located returned a reading that the sensor system classified as empty space. Not biological, not mechanical, not atmospheric. The system's logic architecture had decided that what the sensor was pointing at contained nothing, because the sensor's framework for classifying what it detected did not contain a category for what Saitama was, and when a sensor encounters something outside its classification framework, it defaults to the null reading, which is indistinguishable from empty space. The Force was blind to him. Now the instruments were too. Mace looked at the null reading on the display and thought about the bedrock impression from his meditation and found it slightly more comprehensible than it had been before. "We go to where we last saw him," he said, "on foot." They found him 40 minutes later, not at the location where Mace had last seen him on the battlefield, but 3 kilometers east, which was the direction of the Separatist landing pad that had been used for Dooku's shuttle. The shuttle was gone. Saitama was not technically where Dooku had left him. He was walking back from that direction, along the flat plain, with the slightly purposeful stride of someone returning from somewhere rather than wandering without destination. He was carrying, inexplicably, what appeared to be a piece of Geonosian flatbread that he had acquired from somewhere, and was eating with the focused appreciation of someone who had been hungry and is now addressing that. He saw the 2 Jedi approaching from across the plain and stopped walking and waited for them to close the distance, which they did at a pace that was not quite a run but was faster than a walk, because Mace had spent 14 hours wanting to be back in this man's physical vicinity, and the last 40 minutes of uncertainty about his location had compressed that one into something with more urgency than he usually allowed himself. Obi-Wan got there slightly ahead of Mace and stopped at a respectful distance and said, in the tone he used when he was being deliberately approachable rather than authoritative, "You must be Saitama. I'm Obi-Wan Kenobi. We've come a considerable way to find you." Saitama looked at him and then at Mace, who arrived a moment later and whose expression contained the specific quality of controlled urgency that Saitama had seen on the faces of people who wanted something from him and were trying to manage how much of that want they showed. "The other one found me yesterday," Saitama said, nodding at Mace. "The one with the purple thing." Obi-Wan looked at Mace. "The purple thing is his lightsaber," Mace said to Saitama, with a patience that was slightly more effortful than his usual patience. "It's a weapon. We are Jedi. We are not here as a threat." Saitama took another bite of the flatbread and nodded with the agreeable acceptance of someone who has no reason to dispute this. "The other ones weren't threats either," he said, which Obi-Wan correctly interpreted as a reference to the Separatist forces, and which produced a brief, involuntary exchange of glances between the 2 Jedi that communicated a significant amount of information about how they were each processing the conversation so far. Obi-Wan asked the questions that needed asking, which were the same questions Dooku had asked but arrived at differently. Not as an intelligence-gathering exercise, but as a genuine attempt to understand who Saitama was and what he needed, which Obi-Wan had decided during the transit was the only approach that had any chance of building the kind of trust that would make the conversation useful. Saitama answered the same way he had answered Dooku, honestly and completely, without apparent awareness that he was providing 2 competing galactic powers with identical information. When Obi-Wan got to the question of what Saitama wanted, not what he was, not where he was from, but what he actually wanted in terms of his current situation, Saitama's answer was the same one he had given Dooku, and the same one he would give anyone who asked it with genuine intent. "I want to go home," he said. "After that, nothing. I'd like it to not take too long," Obi-Wan nodded. "We can help with that," he said. The Jedi have access to research archives that may contain information about dimensional displacement events. It would require you to come to Coruscant. Saitama thought about this. Is that far? He asked. Obi-Wan opened his mouth to explain interstellar distances and then closed it again and said simply, "We have a ship. It won't feel long." What neither of them told Saitama, because there was no useful way to say it yet, was that the Separatist shuttle that had left Geonosis 8 hours earlier had filed a flight plan to a destination that Republic intelligence had flagged as a Dooku-controlled system, and that the 14-hour window between Mace's departure and the frigate's return had been 14 hours, in which Dooku had had uncontested access to the most consequential being to arrive in this galaxy in living memory, possibly longer. What Dooku had learned in those 14 hours, and what he had done with what he had learned, and what Darth Sidious was now doing with what Dooku had reported, all of that was already in motion, already building towards something, already past the point where it could be stopped by the Jedi arriving first. They had not arrived first. They had arrived second. And in a galaxy where the difference between first and second in acquiring a strategic advantage had historically been the difference between winning and losing the larger war, second was a position that carried consequences that were only beginning to become visible. The descent through Coruscant's atmosphere was the first thing in this galaxy that made Saitama look up from whatever he was doing and pay sustained, genuine attention to what was outside the viewport. He had been largely indifferent to the transit through hyperspace, which had produced the tunnel of elongated starlight that every being experienced the first time they entered it, and found either terrifying or magnificent, and which Saitama had watched for approximately 40 seconds before concluding it wasn't going anywhere new and returning his attention to a Republic-issue food ration he had been methodically working through. He had slept for most of the remaining journey with the complete, untroubled unconsciousness of someone whose relationship with sleep was purely functional, waking when the frigate decelerated out of hyperspace, and the stars returned to their normal configurations and Coruscant appeared in the viewport as a planet that was also, entirely and without exception, a city. Every surface of it covered, every natural feature built over, the lights of it visible from orbit as a continuous, unbroken luminescence that made the planet look from space like a star that had forgotten to be hot. Saitama pressed his face slightly closer to the viewport than he normally would, and looked at it with the specific quality of attention he reserved for things that were genuinely, unambiguously impressive in the straightforward sense of impressive that didn't require any context or framework to appreciate. It was very big and very lit and very dense, and all of those things were true at once. And for a man whose primary reference point for large urban environments was City Z, which was large by his universe's standard but would have fit inside one of Coruscant's mid-level administrative districts, the scale of it was the kind of thing that registered even through the general indifference he carried everywhere. Obi-Wan, watching him from across the cockpit, found the moment more informative than anything in their conversation had been. The flatness of Saitama's affect throughout the transit had been consistent and complete. Nothing had moved him. Nothing had produced the kind of reaction that most beings produced when encountering the galaxy for the first time. The mixture of wonder and disorientation and scale adjustment that even experienced travelers went through when context shifted dramatically. Coruscant from orbit had cracked it slightly, which told Obi-Wan that the flatness was not the blankness of someone who couldn't feel things, but the deliberate or habituated suppression of someone who had felt things so many times without satisfaction that the default setting had shifted toward conservation. A being who couldn't feel wonder didn't lean toward a viewport. A being who had learned not to expect much from wonder did briefly, when something large enough got through. He filed this observation with the others he had been collecting during the transit and didn't comment on it, because commenting on it would have closed the moment rather than extending it. The Jedi Temple was their destination, which meant the landing approach took them through the upper middle levels of the cityscape, rather than the lower lanes reserved for commercial and civilian traffic. And the route gave a reasonable cross-section of what Coruscant actually was, the gleaming upper-level arcologies, where the Senate and the wealthy and the powerful maintained the face the planet showed to the galaxy. The mid-levels where the administrative machinery of a galactic government ran in the continuous, grinding way of bureaucracies that are too large to be fast but too important to stop, and brief glimpses through the gaps between structures of the lower levels, where the light from above became ambient and diffused, and the city was older and darker, and more honest about what sustained the whole thing from underneath. Saitama looked at all of it with the attentive sweep of someone cataloging an unfamiliar environment for practical reference, and when the Jedi Temple came into view, 5 spires rising above the surrounding cityscape, ancient and deliberate, and carrying the specific visual weight of a structure built to communicate something about the people inside it. He looked at it and said, "That's a big building." Obi-Wan agreed that it was. The council had been prepared for the visit by Mace's transmission from Geonosis and the subsequent communications during transit, which meant that when Saitama walked into the Jedi Temple, it was with the full, focused awareness of the Order concentrated on his arrival. Masters and knights, they passed in the corridors, registered his presence with the specific double-take of Force-sensitive beings encountering the Force's blind spot in physical form for the first time. A moment of reaching outward that returned nothing, followed by the controlled recalibration of someone adjusting to a sensory gap they've been told to expect, but which is still disorienting to experience. Saitama noticed none of this because he had no framework for what they were doing, and walked through the temple with the mild, practical attentiveness of someone in an unfamiliar building, who is following someone who knows where they're going and trusts that the destination will eventually clarify itself. Yoda met them not in the council chamber, but in one of the temple's smaller meditation gardens, which was a deliberate choice that Mace understood immediately and Obi-Wan appreciated. The council chamber communicated authority and institutional weight, and both of those things would have been counterproductive in an initial meeting with a being who had demonstrated complete indifference to institutional frameworks. The garden communicated nothing except the presence of someone who had chosen it for personal rather than strategic reasons, and Yoda sitting on a stone bench surrounded by living things was a significantly less intimidating configuration than Yoda in the council chamber, surrounded by 12 masters and the full apparatus of the Order's formal power. He looked up when Saitama entered the garden and looked at him for a long, quiet moment before saying anything, and the look was the 800-year look, the one that had assessed a very large number of significant things over a very long time and had learned to take the full measure of something before it spoke. Saitama looked back at him with the same mild attentiveness he gave everything, taking in the small green figure, the large ears, the walking stick, the eyes that were old in a way that read even to someone with no Force sensitivity. "Small," Saitama observed, not unkindly. Yoda's ears moved slightly in the way they did when he found something amusing. "Yes," he said, "surprised many are." What followed was a conversation that the temple's archivists, who had been tasked with documenting everything related to the anomaly for the Order's permanent record, struggled to transcribe in a way that conveyed its actual content, because the actual content was less about what was said and more about what the two parties were doing with what was said. Yoda asked questions that were not the questions of an intelligence assessment, not "what are you" and "where do you come from" and "what can you do," which were the questions everyone else had asked. He asked questions about what Saitama found meaningful and what he found empty, and what the training had cost him beyond the physical, because Yoda at 800 years had developed the judgment to know that the most useful information about any being is not their capability, but their relationship to their capability. Saitama answered with the same direct honesty he always brought to questions, and his answers were the answers of someone who had gotten everything he had trained to get and found the getting of it had removed something rather than adding something, and who had been living with that removal for long enough that he had stopped expecting it to resolve. Yoda listened and said nothing for a while after the conversation reached its natural end, and then said something that Saitama received with a brief, genuine expression of consideration that was different from his usual mild attentiveness, something that had been heard rather than just processed. "Strong you are," Yoda said. "Not because trained hard you did, because something in you decided to be enough. For anything." He paused. "What the Force cannot read, not absence, that is. Too much presence for the Force to hold, like trying to see the sun by looking at it directly." Saitama thought about this for a moment. "Is that good or bad?" he asked. Yoda's ears moved again. "Depends," he said, "on what comes next." What came next was already being decided elsewhere. Darth Sidious, having received Dooku's full report and spent the intervening hours processing it with the comprehensive, patient intelligence that had sustained his shadow governance of the Republic for decades, had reached a conclusion that reorganized his relationship to the current phase of his plan in a fundamental way. The plan had always been built around the Force, around the Sith's mastery of it as the ultimate instrument of power, and the Jedi's dependency on it as the ultimate source of their own. It was a closed system, balanced between two poles, and the plan's entire architecture assumed the system remained closed. What was sitting in the Jedi Temple's meditation garden right now was evidence that the system was not closed, that there existed something outside it. And Sidious, who had spent his entire life inside the system and had mastered it more completely than anyone in 1,000 years, sat with the evidence of its incompleteness and felt something he recognized from very long ago, from the early stages of his own education, before he had learned enough to stop feeling it. He felt the galaxy shift underneath him like ground that had seemed solid and had just announced it wasn't. He began making new plans, the way he always made plans, quietly, completely, and with the full understanding that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was no longer the Jedi Order. Darth Sidious did not send droids. He did not send an army, a fleet, or any instrument of conventional galactic power, because conventional galactic power was precisely the category that the available evidence indicated would be insufficient. He had read Dooku's report 4 times, which was 4 more times than he read most reports, and each reading had reinforced the same conclusion from a slightly different angle. The being in the Jedi Temple was not a problem that scaled. Every tool available to galactic power, military force, political leverage, intelligence operations, technological superiority, operated within a framework of relative capability, where sufficiently more of one thing could overcome sufficiently less of another. The battle data from Geonosis described something that existed outside the relative framework entirely, something for which more of anything the galaxy currently possessed was not a meaningful concept, because the differential was not a matter of degree, but of category. You could not address a category problem with a quantity solution. Sidious understood this with the clarity of a being who had spent his entire life thinking in systems, and the clarity produced a strategic pivot that was characteristic of him in its speed, and its ruthlessness, and its complete willingness to discard previous assumptions the moment they became liabilities. What he sent instead was a sage Ventress. The choice was deliberate and multidimensional in the way that Sidious's choices always were, containing more layers of intent than the surface purpose revealed. On the surface, Ventress was a capable dark side assassin with sufficient combat ability and force sensitivity to serve as a credible probe of Saitama's capabilities in a direct engagement, not because Sidious expected her to succeed, but because he needed empirical data on how Saitama responded to a force-based attack that was specifically offensive and targeted rather than the incidental battlefield contact the Geonosis data described. He needed to know whether the Force's inability to read Saitama extended to force-based attacks directed at him, whether a force push, force lightning, or telekinetic assault would interact with him the way physical force had, or whether the blindness was purely sensory, and he remained physically vulnerable to force energy in ways that conventional weapons weren't. Below that surface purpose sat a second layer. If Ventress succeeded in any meaningful way, the information she brought back would be more valuable than any sensor data. And below that second layer sat the layer that was most characteristic of Sidious, which was that Ventress was expendable in the specific sense that her loss would cost him nothing he couldn't replace while potentially providing the data he needed. And her potential capture by the Jedi would create a useful diplomatic complication that could be deployed at a later stage of the plan regardless of what she accomplished on the mission's primary objective. Ventress arrived on Coruscant through a route that Separatist intelligence had maintained for years. One of several covert insertion pathways into the planet's lower levels that had been established during the early phase of Dooku's preparations, and had survived the Republic's counterintelligence efforts through a combination of careful management and the simple logistical reality that Coruscant had a surface area equivalent to a continent-scale city, and the resources required to monitor all of it comprehensively did not exist. She moved through the lower levels toward the Jedi Temple with the focused, fluid efficiency of someone who had done similar things many times, her force presence suppressed to the minimum detectable signature, her route chosen to avoid the temple's standard perimeter monitoring. The plan, to the extent that the approach to Saitama could be called a plan given the available information, was to locate him within the temple grounds, assess his force interaction from a position of concealment, and if the assessment indicated any exploitable vulnerability, engage. If the assessment indicated otherwise, observe and withdraw with the observational data intact. The assessment did not proceed as planned, because Saitama was not where the temple's routine indicated he should be. Ventress had obtained a general location from a source within the lower levels whose reliability she had tested before acting on, and the location was a temple-adjacent open area where Saitama had apparently been spending time since his arrival. One of the exterior platform gardens that the Jedi maintained on the temple's mid-level terraces, accessible from the surrounding cityscape if you had the vertical mobility to reach it, and the situational awareness to avoid the temple's exterior sensors, both of which Ventress possessed. She reached the platform garden and found it occupied, but not by Saitama. It was occupied by a Jedi Knight running solo practice forms, who felt her presence the moment she arrived at the platform's edge, and turned and activated his lightsaber in the smooth, reactive motion of someone trained to respond to exactly this kind of approach. The interruption was an inconvenience rather than an obstacle, and Ventress resolved it with the swift, decisive efficiency that made her valuable to Dooku, and moved on, and was 3 levels higher and 2 platforms over when she found what she was actually looking for. Saitama was sitting on the outer railing of a high temple terrace, his legs dangling over the edge of a drop that was several hundred meters to the nearest lower platform and several kilometers to anything that could be called ground level. He was eating something, a bowl of something that he had apparently persuaded the temple kitchen staff to provide, because one of the consistent patterns that had emerged since his arrival was that temple staff responded to his requests with the cooperative willingness that people extend to beings who ask for things simply, and without any agenda visible in the asking. He was looking at the Coruscant skyline with the comfortable, undemanding attention of someone who has found a good spot and is making use of it. Ventress observed him from a concealed position on a higher terrace, extended her force senses toward him, and received the same nothing that every force-sensitive in this galaxy received from Saitama, the blank, the absence that wasn't an absence, the edge of the map. She tested it more carefully than Mace or Yoda had, probing the edges of the blank with the specific technique Dooku had taught her for reading through force concealment, and found that the technique did not apply because the blank was not concealment. She had encountered force voids before, had trained to navigate them. This was not a void. It was something the Force simply found no surface to touch on, which was different from a void in a way she couldn't fully articulate but could clearly feel, and the feeling of it from this close was deeply, specifically unsettling in a way that she processed and set aside because she was a professional and setting aside discomfort was professional behavior. She decided to test the force attack question directly, not a full offensive strike. She was not going to announce her presence with a committed attack on something she couldn't read and couldn't predict the response of. She used a telekinetic push, small and targeted, the kind of force application she used for precision work rather than combat, directed at the bowl in Saitama's hands. It was a test of whether force energy could interact with his physical environment in a way that registered to him as an external event. The push connected with the bowl and moved it, because the bowl was an ordinary object and the force interacted with ordinary objects normally. Saitama's hands, which were holding the bowl, did not move. The bowl's attempt to move was therefore resolved by the bowl's inability to move relative to Saitama's grip, which from Ventress's perspective looked like the force push simply stopping at the point of his contact, the way a wave stops at a seawall, except that the seawall was a man's fingers wrapped around a bowl of food. She increased the force of the push significantly, enough to have moved a combat-armored clone trooper off their feet. The bowl remained where it was. Saitama looked down at the bowl with a slight frown, the way someone looks at something that has done something unexpected, then looked around the terrace with the methodical scan of a person trying to locate the source of an unusual event. His gaze passed over Ventress's concealed position and did not stop there, because she was concealed, and because his gaze was not force-guided. He was using his eyes, which were ordinary eyes, and she was hidden from ordinary eyes effectively. But the scan continued, patient and systematic, and when it completed a full rotation without producing a result, Saitama looked back at his bowl and then up at the general area of her concealment with the expression of someone who has not located something but has decided it is approximately in a certain direction, and said, in a conversational tone that was not directed at anyone in particular but was clearly directed at someone specific, "I know you're up there." Ventress stepped out of concealment, because the concealment had served its purpose, and because stepping out on her own terms was preferable to the alternative. She stood on the upper terrace and looked down at him and activated both lightsabers, the red blades casting their light across the stone and the open air between them, and looked at the man sitting on the railing with his bowl of food, and found that he was looking at the lightsabers with the same mild, appraising attention he appeared to give everything, nodding them, filing the information, not particularly alarmed. "Those are the light sword things," he said, to no one in particular. Ventress looked at him across the several meters of vertical distance between their terraces and felt the force's blankness around him, and made the assessment that a professional makes when they have gathered sufficient data to update their operational parameters. The data said, the force could not touch him, physical force could not stop him, and he was currently looking at her weapons with the detached curiosity of someone evaluating an object at a market stall. The operational parameter update that this data produced was significant and immediate and completely contrary to her mission's secondary objective. She had her observational data. She had the answer to Sidious's force interaction question, which was that force energy stopped at the boundary of his physical presence as completely as everything else did. She looked at him one more time and then did something that was not in any version of her mission parameters, but which her professional judgment had determined was the only sensible option remaining. She deactivated one lightsaber, kept the other at her side rather than raised, and said, "Dooku sends his regards." Saitama looked at her. "Tell him I'm still waiting on that ride home," he said. Ventress's report reached Dooku within 6 hours of her withdrawal from the temple terrace, transmitted through the encrypted channel they maintained for operational communications that required neither delay nor the routing complications of the standard Separatist intelligence network. It was a short report by the standards of her usual debriefs, not because the mission had been brief, but because the operationally significant content was compact and unambiguous. Force energy stops at physical contact with the subject. Sensory concealment is ineffective at close range through conventional means. Direct engagement was assessed as non-viable based on observational data and the Geonosis battle record. She included, as an appendix, the detail about the bowl, the telekinetic push that had connected with an ordinary object and stopped at the point of his grip. Because Dooku had specifically requested granular interaction data, and the bowl detail was, in its small and precise way, the clearest demonstration of the mechanism available. The Force had moved the bowl. The bowl had been unable to move because his hands were on it. The Force had therefore, in effect, pushed against his hands and accomplished nothing, which meant that Force energy interacted with his physical presence the same way kinetic energy did. It arrived, transferred nothing, and the environment around him absorbed the consequence instead. The bowl had stayed. His hands had not registered the push as a physical event worth acknowledging. This was the sentence in the report that Dooku read most carefully and most times. He forwarded the report to Sidious with his own analysis appended, which was 3 paragraphs long, and concluded with the sentence that his analysis of every data point he had accumulated across the days since Geonosis had been building toward. The subject does not exist within the power architecture of this galaxy in any sense that makes conventional engagement meaningful, and any strategy built on the assumption that sufficient application of available force will produce a different result than what has already been observed is a strategy that will produce the same result as what has already been observed, which is nothing. The implication of this conclusion for the larger plan was something Dooku laid out with the careful, almost reluctant precision of a man delivering a structural assessment to an architect who has already built the building. Not because the architect would want to hear it, but because the structural problem existed regardless of whether it was articulated, and knowing about it was better than not knowing. The plan depended on the Sith's mastery of the Force being the ultimate power in the galaxy. The subject's existence was evidence that the galaxy contained something that was not within the Force's architecture, which meant it was not within the Sith's mastery. This was not a problem with the plan's execution. It was a problem with the plan's premise. Sidious read the analysis and the report together, twice, and then sat in his office in the Senate building. The office he maintained as Chancellor Palpatine, behind the face he had worn for years with the patient discipline of someone who understood that the most powerful disguise is a lifetime of consistent behavior, and looked out at the Coruscant cityscape through the wide viewport with the expression of a man who is thinking through something at a depth that his face has learned not to show. The view from the Chancellor's office was one of the best on the planet, which was something he had arranged deliberately, because the view served multiple functions, not least of which was the function of reminding him daily of the scale of what he was building and the distance it had already come. He looked at the city now and performed the kind of thinking he performed when a situation had moved past the stage where analysis was sufficient and into the stage where something more fundamental was required. The thinking that preceded the decisions that changed the shape of everything that came after them. The decision he arrived at was the decision he had been approaching since the first report from Geonosis, the one he had been circling rather than committing to, because committing to it required acknowledging something that his entire existence had been built to avoid acknowledging. There was something in this galaxy that the Force could not measure, could not contain, and could not touch. The Sith's entire claim to ultimate power was a claim staked on the Force being the ultimate currency of the galaxy, the thing that everything else was measured in, the framework within which all significant action occurred. If the framework had an outside, then the claim was not ultimate. It was merely the most powerful thing within a system that was not the only system. Sidious had spent his life becoming the supreme master of a system. The existence of Saitama was the information that the system had edges, and that was information that changed the nature of everything Sidious had built and everything he still intended to build, and he sat with that information in the Chancellor's chair for a long time before he decided what to do with it. What he decided was not to destroy Saitama, because destroying Saitama was not operationally viable, and because the attempt would consume resources and reveal capabilities that the current phase of the plan could not afford to expose. What he decided was to understand him, which was what Dooku had been attempting and what the Jedi were attempting, but to understand him differently, not in the sense of comprehending his origin or his power mechanism, which were questions that might never be answerable and whose answers might not matter, but in the sense of understanding his relationship to the situation he was in, specifically his desire to go home. Saitama wanted to go home. He had said so consistently to everyone who had spoken to him, and the consistency of it across multiple separate interactions with multiple different agendas was the mark of a genuine primary motivation rather than a strategic communication. He was not invested in the war, not interested in the galaxy's politics, not moved by the Jedi's philosophy or the Sith's vision. He was a man who had landed somewhere he didn't intend to be and wanted to leave, and the only thing in this galaxy that might give him a reason to do something other than wait to leave was if something in this galaxy became sufficiently interesting to engage with before he left. Sidious understood boredom as a strategic vulnerability because he had spent decades studying what drives beings to action, and boredom was one of the most reliable drivers available because it was the condition of someone capable of significant action who currently had no significant action to take, and such conditions resolved themselves one way or another. The opportunity arrived not through any plan Sidious executed, but through the simple consequence of the galaxy being what it was, which was large and violent and full of things that had not yet been told they were supposed to wait. A Separatist fleet, acting on orders that had been issued before Geonosis and not yet countermanded, launched a major assault on the Republic shipyard installation at Sullust, a full-scale engagement involving multiple Separatist capital ships and the Republic defense fleet assigned to the sector. And the battle began with the blunt, immediate violence of large-scale space warfare before anyone in the Senate or the Jedi Council had been informed it was starting. The news reached Coruscant through standard military channels 12 hours after the assault began, by which time the Republic defense fleet was already significantly degraded and the shipyard was in danger of falling. The Council convened an emergency session. Obi-Wan was called from the temple. Mace was called from another engagement. The temple went to crisis footing, which meant that the careful, attentive management of Saitama's presence in the temple that had been the Council's quiet preoccupation for the past several days suddenly dropped several positions in the priority hierarchy, as people who had been assigned to it were pulled toward more immediately critical responsibilities. Saitama noticed the shift in the temple's atmosphere the way he noticed most things, not through any special sense, but through the ordinary observation of someone paying attention to their environment. The corridors that had been consistently populated with Jedi moving at deliberate, purposeful paces were now populated with Jedi moving at faster paces with less consistent direction, the specific pattern of an institution responding to something urgent. He watched this from the temple garden where he had been spending his afternoons, finding the garden's combination of outdoor air and relative quiet the closest available approximation to what he was used to. And he noted the change in movement patterns with the mild, evaluating attention of someone, deciding whether the change was relevant to them. He tracked down a temple staff member who was passing through the garden on a rapid errand and asked what was happening, with the direct simplicity of someone who finds direct questions the most efficient available tool. The staff member, caught between the urgency of their errand and the institutional awareness that this particular person's questions should be answered, stopped long enough to explain. A major battle, a shipyard in danger, a Republic fleet losing. Saitama listened to this, thanked them, and watched them leave. He sat back down on his bench and looked at the sky above the temple's open dome, thinking in the simple, practical way he thought about everything, arriving at the same conclusion. He always arrived at when a situation presented itself to him in the particular configuration of something large happening to people who couldn't stop it on their own. He stood up. He walked toward the temple's hangar level, where he had noticed the ships were kept. The space above Sullust was a three-dimensional catastrophe when Saitama arrived, which was a sentence that required some explanation given that he arrived aboard a Republic shuttle. He had boarded with the cooperative assistance of a temple hangar crew, who had been given no specific instruction to prevent him from boarding Republic vessels, and who had therefore processed his request with the helpful efficiency of people who default to yes when the request is reasonable, and the requester doesn't appear to be a threat. The shuttle's pilot, a clone trooper whose assignment was routine temple-to-fleet courier runs, had been informed by the boarding crew that the passenger was a guest of the Jedi Council, and had accepted this framing without additional questions, because clone troopers were trained to execute their operational parameters rather than interrogate the peripheral circumstances of each assignment. By the time anyone in the temple's logistics chain realized that the shuttle's destination had been updated to the Sullust engagement sector rather than its standard courier route, the shuttle was already in hyperspace, and the realization existed as a priority communication chasing a vessel it could not reach until it dropped back into real space. What was happening above Sullust when the shuttle arrived was a battle that had passed through its crisis phase and was now in the terminal phase, the phase where the outcome is no longer genuinely uncertain, but the machinery of the engagement has too much momentum to stop before the outcome is fully realized. 6 Separatist Munificent-class frigates and 2 Providence-class carriers had engaged the Republic defense fleet of 3 Venator-class star destroyers and their escort complement, and the differential in numbers and firepower had produced the result that differentials of that magnitude reliably produce. One Venator was already dead in space, its systems catastrophically compromised by concentrated turbolaser fire, the crew abandoning it in escape pods that were scattered across the engagement zone like seeds from a broken pod. The second Venator was fighting at severely reduced capacity, its portside batteries silent and its shields down to emergency coverage on the dorsal hull. The third was still fully operational, but outnumbered in a way that full operation alone couldn't compensate for, and its captain had been composing an evacuation recommendation for 20 minutes while continuing to fight because composing and transmitting were different steps, and the second step required a certainty the captain hadn't yet reached about whether leaving was worse than staying. The shuttle entered the engagement zone and immediately attracted fire from 3 Separatist vessels, whose automated targeting systems classified it as a Republic asset and engaged accordingly. The turbolaser bolts that connected with the shuttle produced results that the Separatist gunners, reviewing their targeting telemetry, would have classified as sensor malfunction if they had been reviewing it, which they weren't because the battle required their attention elsewhere. The bolts connected with the shuttle and the shuttle's hull, and the shuttle's hull did not respond the way Republic shuttle hulls respond to turbolaser fire, which is by failing structurally and rapidly. It responded by continuing to exist, which was not the anticipated outcome of sustained turbolaser contact, and the shuttle continued its approach vector toward the center of the engagement, as if the fire were atmospheric rather than ordnance. This was because Saitama was sitting in the co-pilot seat, and the shuttle's continued structural integrity in the face of weapons fire designed to defeat capital ship plating was a consequence of his presence on it rather than any property of the shuttle itself. The clone pilot was managing a level of professional stress that was visible in the set of his shoulders and the specific quality of his breathing, but not in his hands, which remained steady on the controls with the trained composure of someone whose conditioning was doing heavy lifting for them. He had watched his targeting telemetry show sustained hits from weapons that should have ended the vessel 3 times over, and he had watched the vessel continue to exist, and he had filed this experience in the place in his mind where things went when they were real and also made no sense. And he continued flying because flying was what he knew to do, and the man in the co-pilot seat appeared unconcerned. Saitama was looking at the battle through the viewport with the focused, evaluating attention he brought to situations. He was trying to understand before deciding what to do about them. The scale of it was different from the Geonosis ground battle. Space combat operated at distances and velocities that made the individual components of it visible as lights and trails of energy rather than discrete objects, until you were close enough that the scale of the individual vessels resolved into something comprehensible. The closest Separatist frigate, a munificent class whose broadside was currently directed at the damaged Venator, was perhaps 3 kilometers away, which was close enough that its hull was a substantial object filling a significant portion of the viewport rather than a distant geometric abstraction. Saitama looked at it. He looked at the Venator it was firing on. He looked at the clone pilot, who was looking at him with the expression of someone waiting to be told what the plan was. There was no plan, in the sense that Saitama did not construct tactical frameworks for situations he hadn't been in before. He addressed what was in front of him, and what was in front of him was a large machine that was destroying something and needed to stop doing that. He asked the pilot to open the shuttle's side hatch, which request the pilot processed for 2 seconds before complying because the only framework he had for the request was that the passenger wanted the hatch open, and the passenger had demonstrated across the entire approach that the conventional rules of what was survivable did not apply to him. The hatch opened. The vacuum of space did the thing vacuum does, which is attempt to equilibrate the pressure differential, and Saitama braced against it with the casual ease of someone leaning into a moderate wind, looked at the frigate 3 kilometers away, and jumped. Space is not a medium that jumping works in any conventional sense, because jumping requires something to push against, and the push produces movement relative to what was pushed. And in the vacuum between objects, the only thing to push against is the last solid surface that was underfoot. The shuttle's hatch frame served as that surface, and Saitama's departure from it was the departure of something launched rather than jumped. A straight line through vacuum toward the munificent frigate's hull, crossing 3 kilometers of nothing in the time it would have taken him to run 100 meters on the ground. He hit the frigate's dorsal hull with the impact that his trajectory and mass, and the nature of what he was produced when delivered at that velocity. And the result was a crater in capital ship plating that was 4 meters across and 2 meters deep, and surrounded by a radiating fracture pattern that ran through the hull like a dropped plate. And he stood at the center of it in the vacuum of space with his cape, doing nothing because there was no air to move it, and looked down at the damage his landing had done, and then looked at the hull around him and began walking toward the frigate's bridge superstructure. Aboard the Republic flagship, the surviving Venator, Admiral Yularen was watching the tactical display with the comprehensive attention of a man who has been in enough engagements to read the whole picture simultaneously rather than focusing on individual elements. And the picture had just changed in a way that his display was technically showing him, but which he was having difficulty accepting as an accurate representation of events. The munificent frigate that had been the primary threat vector against his damaged sister ship had just registered a hull impact on its dorsal surface at a location, and with an energy signature that corresponded to nothing in the Admiral's experience of space combat. Not a torpedo, not a boarding pod, not any weapon system in the Republic's or the Separatist arsenal that he knew of. A point impact, single contact, kinetic in nature, producing structural damage to capital ship plating that his ship's sensors assessed as equivalent to a heavy proton torpedo hit, from something that his long-range visual feed showed as a person. He looked at the visual feed display and looked at it again and looked at the tactical officer. "What is that?" he said. The tactical officer looked at the display and said, with the professional honesty of someone who had accepted that honesty was the only useful option. "I don't know, sir." What it was the beginning of the end of the Battle of Sullust, though nobody watching from the Republic ships understood it yet, because understanding it required a framework they hadn't had time to construct. Saitama had reached the Munificence Bridge superstructure and addressed it with the same open palm strike he had used on the Hailfire droid on Geonosis, which was his measured application rather than a committed punch. And the superstructure's response to the measured application was structurally comprehensive and irreversible, and happened fast enough that the frigate's command crew did not have time to complete the evacuation protocol before the bridge section was no longer a section of anything that could be called a bridge. The frigate's operational capacity collapsed without its command architecture, and the collapse was visible on Admiral Yularen's tactical display as a power signature flatline that his systems associated with catastrophic system failure. The frigate began to drift. The Separatist battle network, which processed the loss of a capital ship as a significant tactical event requiring reallocation of resources, began the reallocation. And on the dorsal hull of the drifting frigate, Saitama looked at the 5 remaining Separatist vessels arrayed across the engagement zone and the 2 Republic ships still fighting, and exhaled the slow, quiet breath of someone who has done the first part of something and is assessing what the remaining parts look like. 5 capital ships was more than one, but one at a time was the same process repeated, and the process was simple. He looked at the nearest Separatist vessel, calculated the jump, and left the hull. The Battle of Sullust ended in 47 minutes from the point of Saitama's first hull impact, which was a duration that the Republic's tactical analysts, reviewing the engagement data afterward, would classify as the fastest resolution of a multi-capital ship engagement in the recorded history of the Clone Wars. The classification was accurate and also completely failed to capture what had actually happened, because the classification system used by tactical analysts was built to describe battles in terms of fleet maneuvers, weapons exchanges, shield degradation curves, and command decisions. And what had happened at Sullust did not fit inside any of those categories, except as a series of anomalous readings that the system kept flagging as sensor errors and kept being told were not sensor errors. Each of the 5 remaining Separatist capital ships had registered, in sequence, a single-point hull impact on their command superstructures followed by immediate power signature collapse, at intervals of approximately 6 to 8 minutes per vessel, the intervals corresponding to the time required to traverse the distance between ships in vacuum by a method the sensor systems had no classification for. By the time the 6th and final vessel went dark, the engagement zone was a field of drifting hulls and dispersing escape pod clusters, and the Republic ships were the only operational vessels remaining, and the tactical situation had transitioned from terminal defeat to complete victory, without passing through any of the intermediate stages that tactical analysis frameworks used to describe how battles ended. Admiral Yularen filed his after-action report with the care of a professional who understands that the report will be read by people who were not present and who will form their understanding of events entirely from what the report contains. He was honest in the report because honesty was his professional ethic, and because he had calculated, with the practical intelligence of someone who has spent a career navigating institutional information management, that dishonesty about events of this scale and this documentation density was not viable. Too many sensor logs, too many crew accounts, too much visual record existed across 2 Republic ships and their full complement of recording systems for a sanitized account to survive contact with the review process. He described what the sensors had recorded, what his tactical officer had reported, what his own eyes had shown him on the visual display, and what the outcome had been, and he concluded the report with a paragraph that he wrote and rewrote 4 times before deciding that the version which simply stated the facts without attempting to frame them was the most defensible. The Republic fleet at Sullust had been preserved by the intervention of a single non-fleet individual, whose identity was confirmed as the Jedi Temple's current guest, and whose method of engagement with enemy capital ships had no precedent in any tactical record the Admiral had access to, and whose outcome had been complete in every case with no observed degradation across the 6 engagements, and whose physical presence in vacuum during the engagement had apparently been without negative consequence to the individual despite the absence of any visible life support equipment. He submitted the report, and then sat in his command chair for a while, thinking the specific thoughts of a person who has just participated in an event that has no category, and is deciding what relationship to have with the absence of the category. The report reached the Republic Senate through the standard military intelligence pipeline within 18 hours, which was fast by Senate standards but not unusually fast, and the 18 hours were sufficient for the information to have moved through the informal channels that always parallel the formal ones in large political institutions, the aid-to-aid communications, the intelligence officer briefings, the whisper networks that exist in every sufficiently complex organization, and that frequently move significant information faster than the official systems designed for the purpose. By the time the Senate's Military Oversight Committee convened an emergency closed session to review the Sullust data, a meaningful fraction of the Senate already had a working understanding of what the data contained, and the working understanding was producing the range of reactions that significant and unprecedented information reliably produces in large political bodies, which ranged from aggressive skepticism through calculating pragmatism to something that, in a less formal institutional context, would have been called fear. Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan was in the fraction that had received the information through the informal channels before the committee session, and his response was the response of someone whose political instincts and personal ethics were both well-developed and generally pointed in the same direction. He read the sensor data and the Admiral's report and the corroborating crew accounts, and arrived at a conclusion about the situation's implications that was several steps ahead of where most of his colleagues were, not because he was smarter than them, but because he had been paying closer attention to the Jedi Temple's communications about their unusual guest since Mace Windu's initial transmission from Geonosis. He had a contact in the Temple's administrative staff, not a source in any intelligence sense, simply a person he trusted who occasionally shared information when the information seemed relevant to people who should know it. And the picture assembled from the Temple's internal communications and the Sullust battle data was a picture that produced a very specific kind of concern in someone with Bail Organa's particular combination of political acuity and genuine care for what the Republic was supposed to mean. The concern was not about Saitama. The concern was about who else was assembling the same picture and what conclusions they were drawing from it, and what they intended to do about those conclusions. Because the information that a being existed in the galaxy who could end capital ship engagements alone, and in vacuum, was information that every significant power in the galaxy would now possess. And the range of responses that the galaxy's significant powers historically applied to things of unprecedented strategic value was not a range that contained many outcomes Bail Organa found comfortable to contemplate. On the Separatist side, the Sullust data arrived at Dooku simultaneously through the Battle Network's engagement logs and through Ventress's separate intelligence channel, and Dooku processed it against everything he already knew with the speed of someone whose analytical framework was already substantially built and required only new data points rather than new architecture. The data confirmed and extended what he had already concluded. The capability was consistent across contexts, scaled with the size of the opposition without appearing to cost anything, and produced complete outcomes rather than partial ones. 6 capital ships, 47 minutes, no visible exertion. He added these facts to the file he had been building since Geonosis, and the file was now comprehensive enough to support a conclusion he delivered to Sidious in a transmission that was 3 sentences long because 3 sentences were sufficient when the conclusion was clear. Conventional engagement is not viable at any scale. The subject will resolve military situations the same way across different sizes and configurations of opposition. The only strategic options remaining involve either the subject's cooperation or the subject's departure from the galaxy. And the first option depends on factors we cannot control, and the second option depends on research we cannot yet complete. Sidious received the 3 sentences and read them in the Chancellor's office with Coruscant spread out below him, and felt the reorientation of his planning architecture completing itself in a way that was unpleasant and necessary and characteristic of how he operated when the facts changed, completely, without nostalgia for the previous version, with the cold efficiency of someone who has decided that the only useful response to reality is to work with it. The galaxy was watching now. The Senate knew. The intelligence agencies knew. The military commands on both sides of the war knew. The thing that had been a battlefield anomaly at Geonosis and a temple curiosity on Coruscant was now a documented, censor-confirmed, multiply-witness strategic fact. And strategic facts at this scale did not remain manageable once they became widely known, because widely known strategic facts attracted the attention of everyone with a stake in strategy, which in a galactic war was essentially everyone with any power at all. The window for managing the situation quietly had closed at Sullust. Whatever happened next would happen in front of the entire galaxy, and Sidious pivoted his planning toward that reality with the decisive speed of someone who had been expecting the window to close and had been preparing for what came after it. In the shuttle returning to Coruscant, Saitama was asleep in the co-pilot seat again, with the same complete, untroubled unconsciousness of the transit out. The clone pilot flew in silence, because there was nothing he had words for that the flight's mission log didn't already contain, and watched the hyperspace tunnel extend ahead of them, and thought about what he had watched happen at Sullust from the cockpit of a shuttle that should have been destroyed in the first 30 seconds of the engagement, and was currently intact and carrying a man who had stepped into vacuum and walked across the hulls of enemy capital ships and come back with his cape slightly more rumpled than when he left. The pilot had been engineered for combat, trained for it, psychologically conditioned to operate within it without losing function, and he was sitting with the information that combat as he understood it and combat as he had just witnessed were not the same category of thing, and the information was sitting in him the way large information sits, heavily, quietly, rearranging the furniture of everything it was adjacent to. He flew the ship. Saitama slept. The galaxy, behind them and ahead of them and in every direction simultaneously, was beginning to understand that the map it had been using was not sufficient for the territory anymore, and the understanding was spreading at the speed that important and frightening information always spreads, which is faster than anyone plans for and slower than anyone needs. Darth Sidious had been many things across his long life, but the thing he had been most consistently, most fundamentally, and most successfully was patient. Patience was not a virtue he had cultivated in the way that the Jedi cultivated their qualities, not through philosophy or meditation or the conscious shaping of character toward an ideal. It was a strategic tool he had refined across decades of operating in situations where the difference between moving too early and moving at the right moment was the difference between a plan that succeeded completely and a plan that succeeded partially. And partial success in the game he was playing was indistinguishable from failure because the game was binary. He had waited years for each phase of his design to mature before triggering the next one, and the waiting had always been rewarded because he had understood that the most powerful thing in the galaxy was not the Force and not the Sith and not any weapon system or army or political institution. It was time, applied with precision to situations that were already moving in a favorable direction. Time and patience were the instruments through which he had brought the galaxy to this moment, and he had never once in all those years made the mistake of confusing urgency with necessity. He was feeling something adjacent to urgency now, which he recognized and categorized and set aside, because feeling something adjacent to urgency was information about the situation rather than a directive about how to respond to it. The information it provided was that the situation had a timeline that was not entirely within his control, which was itself a data point. The situations that had timelines outside his control were the situations that required the most careful handling, because care applied to them compounded in the same way that urgency misapplied to them degraded. He sat in the Chancellor's office in the late Coruscant evening, when the traffic lanes outside the viewport had thinned to the quiet flows of a city that never fully slept but did slow down, and he made the decision he had been building toward since the first Geonosis report arrived. The decision was this: Saitama would return home, and Darth Sidious would make it happen. Not as a gift, not as an act of goodwill, and not because helping Saitama served any conventional definition of the Sith's interest. He would make it happen because Saitama's continued presence in the galaxy was a variable that could not be controlled, and uncontrollable variables in a plan of this precision and this duration were not acceptable regardless of whether they were currently expressing themselves as threats. The Jedi were building a relationship with him. The Senate was beginning to discuss him as a strategic asset. Military commanders on both sides were updating their doctrines in response to what had happened at Sullust. The galaxy was in the process of incorporating Saitama into its existing power frameworks the way it incorporated everything. By assigning him a role, building dependencies on his presence, creating structures that would persist beyond any single engagement, and that would generate the kind of institutional momentum that made change difficult. Every day he remained was a day more of that incorporation happened, and incorporation meant entanglement, and entanglement meant that removing him later became progressively more complicated in ways that complexity always became complicated. Not through any single catastrophic complication, but through the accumulated weight of many small ones that added together until the whole structure resisted change. Sidious had built his own plan on exactly this principle of accumulated entanglement, and he recognized it operating around Saitama with the clarity of someone watching a process they designed being applied to a different subject. The research into dimensional displacement had been proceeding in the Jedi archives, which Sidious knew because he had access to the temple's research communications through channels that had been in place for years. The Jedi had made progress. Jedi Master Sinu, whose specialty in obscure force phenomena made him the Order's most relevant resource for this kind of inquiry, had identified 3 texts in the deep archive that contained accounts of dimensional displacement events from the earliest period of the Republic's history, accounts that described the phenomenon in terms that were pre-scientific, but contained enough operational detail to be useful as a foundation for a more rigorous modern analysis. The analysis was ongoing and its timeline was uncertain, but the direction was clear and the progress was real. The Jedi would eventually be able to reconstruct the displacement mechanism and send Saitama home. What Sidious intended was to get there first, to be the one who provided the solution, because being the one who sent Saitama home meant being the one who controlled the timing of his departure, and controlling the timing of his departure meant controlling the moment at which the uncontrollable variable was removed from the board. He activated the resources he maintained inside the Republic's own scientific establishment, not force-based resources, not separatist intelligence assets, but the network of researchers, archivists, and academics whose cooperation he had built across decades through the careful, patient application of political favor and institutional support. People who worked inside Republic institutions, and whose work he had funded or protected at critical moments, and who therefore owed him the kind of obligation that is never formally acknowledged but is always understood. He tasked them with the dimensional displacement research through intermediaries who did not know who they were ultimately working for, structured the tasking as a Republic Senate emergency research initiative on spatial anomalies, a framing that was legitimate, was within his authority as Chancellor, and would draw the best available minds to the problem without any of them understanding the full picture of why the problem mattered. The research would proceed faster than the Jedi archive work because it had more resources and a clearer directive, and when it produced results, those results would arrive on his desk before they arrived anywhere else, because that was how he had structured every information flow that mattered to him across his entire career. While the research ran, there remained the immediate management of Saitama's presence in the temple and the growing Senate conversation about his strategic role, and Sidious managed both with the unhurried precision of a man tending a garden he understands thoroughly. In the Senate, he used his position as Chancellor to steer the Military Oversight Committee's discussion away from the most dangerous framings, specifically the framing of Saitama as a Republic strategic asset that should be formally integrated into the war effort, which would have created exactly the institutional dependencies and entanglements he was working to prevent. He did this not by opposing the idea openly, which would have been conspicuous, but by raising procedural concerns about jurisdiction, and by quietly ensuring that the testimony provided to the committee by the Republic's own legal experts emphasized the complications of conscripting an individual whose origin, legal status, and rights under Republic law were entirely undefined. A framing that was accurate, was genuinely complex, and reliably produced the legislative paralysis that complex, accurate framings always produced in large deliberative bodies. What he had not accounted for was Saitama's own relationship to the situation, because accounting for it had required information he hadn't had until Ventress's report provided it. And even with that report, the accounting was imprecise, because Saitama's motivations were simple in a way that made them difficult to model for someone whose entire analytical framework was built for complexity. Ventress had noted that Saitama was bored, and Sidious had read this as a strategic vulnerability, in the sense that boredom makes beings susceptible to engagement, and engagement creates entanglement. What he had not fully weighted was the other side of the boredom, the possibility that boredom sufficient in duration and depth produces not engagement but withdrawal, the specific decision of a being who has been waiting long enough and found nothing sufficiently engaging to justify continued waiting, to simply stop waiting and address the core problem directly through whatever means are available. Saitama had been in the temple for 9 days. He had spoken to Yoda twice more, each conversation shorter than the last. He had eaten temple food with consistent appreciation and increasingly limited interest in anything else the temple offered. He had stopped going to the terrace garden in the afternoons and had taken to sitting in the hangar level instead, watching the ships come and go with the specific quality of attention that is less observation and more preparation. The attention of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to execute it rather than the attention of someone who is still deciding. Obi-Wan had noticed this shift and reported it to Mace, and Mace had reported it to the Council, and the Council had discussed it with the concern of people who understood what it might mean, but were not certain enough about the nature of Saitama's capabilities and his relationship to the dimensional displacement mechanism to know what it meant practically if he decided to try to leave on his own terms. And on the evening of the 9th day, in the hangar level of the Jedi Temple, Saitama stood up from the crate he had been sitting on, walked to a temple shuttle, and told the hangar crew he was going for a walk, which was technically inaccurate but was the closest available description for what he intended. And the hangar crew, who had not been given specific instructions about this particular situation, because nobody had fully anticipated this particular situation, opened the hangar bay doors. because that was what hangar bay doors were for, and the shuttle launched into the Coruscant night, and the temple's alert system triggered 4 seconds later, and Mace Windu was running toward his own ship before the alert had finished sounding. And in the Chancellor's office, the notification of the shuttle's unauthorized departure arrived on Sidious's desk, and he read it and set it down and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that events were moving faster than his management of them. The shuttle Saitama had taken from the temple hangar was not equipped for deep space navigation, in the sense that a Republic military vessel was equipped. It had a functional hyperdrive, standard life support, and the navigational database that all temple shuttles carried, which covered the core systems thoroughly and the mid and outer rim adequately, and it had a pilot who knew how to use those systems, which was Saitama, who had spent 9 days in the temple observing how the people around him interacted with their technology, and had arrived at a working understanding of shuttle operation through the same simple, methodical observation he applied to everything. He had not asked anyone to teach him. He had watched, and the watching had been sufficient because the fundamental operation of a Republic shuttle was not complex, and because Saitama's relationship with practical tasks was the relationship of someone who has trained beyond the point where anything physical is genuinely difficult, and for whom the limiting factor in learning new physical skills is time spent observing rather than any difficulty in the execution. He took the shuttle out of Coruscant's traffic lanes and into open space above the planet and stopped there, in a high parking orbit, and looked at the star field through the viewport. He was not running. That was the first thing that needed to be understood about what he was doing, because the reading of his departure as an escape was a reading generated by the frameworks of the people reacting to it rather than by anything in his actual situation or intent. He had left because 9 days of being waited on and studied and carefully managed had produced in him the specific restlessness that accumulated when the environment he was in was not one he had chosen, and the people in it, however well-intentioned, were relating to him as something to be understood rather than as a person going about his life. The temple had been kind and the food had been acceptable, and Yoda had said things worth thinking about, but none of it was what he had come for because he hadn't come for anything. He had been deposited here by a light and a displacement event he still didn't fully understand, and the 9 days had not materially advanced his understanding of how to reverse that event. And the gap between where he was and where he wanted to be was the same size it had been when he arrived, except that now it had 9 days of other people's agendas layered on top of it. He looked at the star field and thought about home the way he always thought about home, not with the sharp ache of dramatic longing, but with the dull, persistent awareness of something absent that should be present, the way a tooth gap is always there at the edge of awareness even when you're not thinking about it. He thought about his apartment, which was small and had a drafty window he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. He thought about the Hero Association, which was frustrating and bureaucratic, and occasionally sent him to fight monsters he dispatched in a single punch before anyone else had finished suiting up. He thought about Geonosis, who was probably filing increasingly formal missing person reports with the association in the particular way that Geonosis approached problems he couldn't solve through direct action, which was to document them comprehensively in the hope that comprehensive documentation would eventually produce a solution. He thought about the grocery store and the sale that had already ended and the cabbage he had not bought, and the thinking about cabbage was the specific detail that made the distance feel real in a way the larger abstractions didn't, because the largest feelings often need the smallest concrete details to become fully legible. The notification that a ship had left a high Coruscant parking orbit and entered hyperspace reached Mace Windu in his own ship 11 minutes after he launched from the temple hangar, which was 11 minutes too late to intercept, and exactly as late as he had calculated it would probably be when he was still running toward his ship and already doing the math. He decelerated out of pursuit mode and held his position in high orbit and reached out to the Force in the direction of the vanished shuttle's last vector, with the focused, particular attention of someone who is not trying to read the being at the vector's end, but is trying to feel the shape of the space around where that being was, the impression technique he had been developing since the transit back from Geonosis. He sat with what it returned for a long time, long enough that his co-pilot checked the instruments twice to confirm they were still in position, and what it returned was not distress, and was not urgency, and was not the dark turbulence of a being making a destructive choice. It was something quieter than any of those things, something that had the texture of resolution, not the resolution of a conflict, but the resolution of a question that has been sitting unanswered for long enough that the being carrying it has decided to answer it themselves, rather than waiting for the answer to arrive. He reported to the Council, and the Council convened, and the session had the specific quality of a deliberation that is working through a situation it cannot reverse, and is therefore trying to determine what the appropriate relationship to the irreversible is. Yoda said during the session the thing that organized the conversation around itself the way the most useful statements always do, the thing that everyone else was approaching from the outside and that he stated from the inside, having seen it directly during his conversations with Saitama in the garden. Home he must go, Yoda said, not because cannot stay, because staying not what he is. A visitor he was always, visitors return. He paused. What he gave us, not his presence, his passing through. The shape of the door he made when he came. We must look at that door. The Council sat with this, and the looking at the door that Yoda described was the work of the days that followed, because the door was real and its shape was visible, and studying its shape was the most useful thing available to people who had not been able to prevent the departure and who understood, with the clear-eyed honesty of beings who had spent their lives looking at what was rather than what they wished were, that preventing it would not have been right even if it had been possible. What had happened was not reversible, and the not reversible part was not Saitama's departure. The not reversible part was everything that had happened before the departure, which had permanently altered the galaxy's understanding of itself in ways that were already expressing themselves in the institutions and conversations and planning documents and tactical doctrine revisions that were propagating through every significant power structure from the Senate to the Separatist command to the intelligence agencies of a dozen independent systems. The galaxy had always understood itself as a closed system. Everything that existed within it could be understood through the Force or through technology or through politics or through some combination of those things, and everything that couldn't yet be understood was assumed to be understandable in principle through more sophisticated application of the available tools. That assumption had been foundational to the Jedi's practice, to the Sith's philosophy, to the Republic's institutional self-conception, to every ideology and power structure that had built itself on the premise that the galaxy was, in the final analysis, a comprehensible place governed by knowable rules that sufficiently capable beings could master. Saitama had been in the galaxy for 11 days and had not challenged that assumption through argument or demonstration of superior force ability or any act of cosmic significance. He had simply existed in the galaxy's presence as something the galaxy's comprehension framework couldn't reach, and the existence had been sufficient. The Jedi changed. Not dramatically, not through any formal doctrinal revision, not through a council declaration or a new curriculum. They change the way large institutions change when a foundational assumption has been genuinely destabilized, slowly, in the thinking of their members, in the questions asked during training sessions, in the way experienced masters talked to younger Jedi about the limits of what the Force revealed and the importance of the space beyond those limits. The most significant change was in Yoda's teaching, which shifted in the months following Saitama's departure toward an emphasis the Order had always had in principle, but had underweighted in practice. The value of meeting things you cannot understand with curiosity rather than the need to classify. He told the story of the visitor from another world to every class of initiates for the rest of his long years, not as a cautionary tale and not as an inspiring one, but as a story about what the galaxy was actually like. Larger than the maps said, full of things that the maps didn't cover. Requiring of anyone who wanted to navigate it honestly the willingness to encounter the edge of their own comprehension and stay with it rather than retreating to the false comfort of a framework that was insufficient for the reality. Darth Sidious continued his plan. The Senate fell in time in the way he had designed it to fall, and the Empire rose from it the way he had designed it to rise, and he sat on the throne he had built across half a century of patient, merciless work, and looked out at the galaxy he had shaped and felt the force coursing through it under his direction, and felt the absolute certainty of his mastery of it. He had not forgotten Saitama. He had incorporated the fact of Saitama into his understanding of what the Force's mastery meant, which was not universal mastery of all things that existed, but mastery of the Force itself as a system, which was the most powerful system within the galaxy's known architecture. The qualification was one he had not needed before, and living with it required the specific discipline of a being who has built an identity on comprehensiveness, and must now carry the knowledge that the comprehensiveness has a limit without allowing that knowledge to hollow out what the comprehensiveness is worth. He carried it the way he carried everything, without showing it, without resolving it, using it as information and letting it sit alongside everything else that information had to sit alongside when you were responsible for the governance of a galaxy. Somewhere in a different universe, in an apartment in City Z, a man in a yellow suit woke up on his floor with the disoriented feeling of someone who had fallen asleep somewhere unexpected and returned to a familiar location while unconscious. He lay there for a moment taking inventory of his surroundings, the drafty window, the stacked mail, the grocery flyer on the counter with a sale that had already ended. He sat up. He looked at his hands, which had scorch marks on the gloves from blaster fire that was not from any weapon manufactured in this dimension. He looked at the marks for a moment, and then he looked at the apartment, and then he stood up, took his gloves off, put them on the counter next to the grocery flyer, and went to see if there was anything in the refrigerator worth eating. There was not. He put on his tracksuit, because the regular suit needed washing, and went out to find a convenience store that was open. The city was the same as it had always been. The sky was the right color. Nothing required immediate attention. He bought a can of crab and a bag of rice and walked home, and the galaxy 11 dimensions away continued to change in the shape of the door he had made when he passed through it, and he didn't know that, and it wouldn't have changed anything if he had. The universe he had visited would never be the same, and he was thinking about what to have for dinner.